I want to take a look at how these types of questions are scored. So I'm going to get a couple of these answers wrong just to demonstrate how to score these. In this question, the claim is that the proportion of patients taking Lipitor who experience flu-like symptoms is at least 50%. So for one thing, we know it's a proportion problem. So that means in this list of claims, make sure you're choosing a P for proportion, a U if it's a mean. So I'm looking at the proportions and it says it's at least 50%. So at least suggests that the claim is greater than or equal to. So I'm going to choose one of these other ones to get this one wrong. So let's say I thought it meant, at least meant greater than. Now I know that the opposite of greater than is less than or equal to. But of course, since this first one is wrong, the opposite is wrong. So if the claim is wrong, the opposite is wrong. But let's continue on. Then this claim corresponds to my alternative hypothesis, which will have the same symbol, greater than. Now the one that has the equal sign becomes my null hypothesis, and that gets converted into equals. So all of these three, the alternative hypothesis, the null hypothesis, and the opposite are wrong because the claim was wrong. However, because these all came from, or let me be more specific, the H1, the alternative hypothesis, came from the claim, the opposite came from the claim, and then the null hypothesis came from the opposite having the equal sign. These should be equal, correct. Now the test statistic, if you do some calculations, you should find, in this particular problem, I'd get negative 2.71, and the p-value, looking that up into the left tail, should be 0.0034. Also keep in mind that the test, whether it be left tail, right tail, or two tail, is also dependent on the alternative hypothesis. So we also need to decide if we're going to reject or fail to reject. Now, 0.0034, we're talking about a p-value, so I compare that to the significance level. 0.003 is smaller than the significance level. So my p-value is low, my null must go. So the correct answer would be to reject the null hypothesis. Now if I fail to reject the null hypothesis, that should be marked wrong because that is based on the p-value and the significance level. However, if I fail to reject the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis, in this case, I have it going with the opposite, now that should tell me that there is not enough evidence to support the claim, because I'm failing to reject the null hypothesis, which goes with the opposite. So if I submit this, my fail to reject the null hypothesis should be marked wrong, because that comes from the p-value and significance level, but my conclusion should be correct, because if I fail to reject the null hypothesis, that would mean there's not enough evidence to support the claim. So let's see what happens. So tells me my conclusion about the null hypothesis is wrong, but my overall conclusion is correct. Now let's say I come through here and I change my answer. I realize, oh, this should actually be at least means greater than or equal to. Now what should happen is everything else is going to be marked incorrect in this top portion, because my opposite is no longer the opposite of the claim. So now everything that was marked correct earlier is now incorrect. The null hypothesis is still correct because that comes from the opposite, which has an equal sign in it. But once I get this correct, being that it should be p is less than, I know the claim has an equals in it, so this should actually be my null hypothesis. But now this null hypothesis will be marked incorrect because it should come from the opposite, which should give me, in this case, my alternative hypothesis. So it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole, but very logically. So if I change this to reject to make it correct, and I'm rejecting the null hypothesis, there actually still is not enough evidence to support the claim. So now everything is correct. I just have to realize that this is a left tail test. And you've got it all correct.